Picture this. A retired Army colonel standing on the marble steps of his grandfather's $20 million estate, watching as 3 HOA board members march up his driveway with eviction papers, thinking they've finally cornered their biggest problem resident. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just any homeowner. This was a man who'd spent 30 years commanding respect in the most powerful military in the world, and he was about to remind them exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong person. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, because you're about to witness one of the most spectacular HOA takedowns in residential history. This isn't your typical neighborhood dispute. This is what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. The estate in question wasn't just any house. Built in 1952 by one of the city's most prominent architects, this palatial masterpiece sat on 15 acres of pristine landscape, complete with hand-carved Italian marble fountains, imported French limestone walls, and gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines for decades. But to the Willowbrook Estates HOA, it represented something far more threatening than beauty. It represented independence they couldn't control. Colonel James Mitchell had never planned to become the enemy of his own neighborhood. After 30 years of distinguished military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and a commendation for outstanding leadership during the Iraq conflict, all he wanted was to enjoy his retirement in the home that held 3 generations of family memories. The estate had been his grandfather's crowning achievement. Theodore Mitchell, a successful industrialist in the 1950s, had commissioned the property as a testament to American prosperity and craftsmanship. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the imported marble that lined the grand foyer to the custom ironwork that adorned the property's perimeter. The house itself sprawled across 12,000 square feet, featuring 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a library that rivaled those found in universities, and a ballroom where Theodore once hosted charity galas for the city's elite. But the estate's most remarkable feature wasn't visible from the street. Hidden behind the main house lay an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a tennis court regulation-sized for professional play, and a greenhouse complex that Theodore had used to cultivate rare orchids. The property also included a separate guest house, originally built for visiting dignitaries and business associates, which alone was larger than most suburban homes. When Colonel Mitchell inherited the estate in 2019, following his father's passing, the property was valued at just over $20 million. The valuation wasn't just based on size, it was the historical significance, the architectural integrity, and the prime location within what was now the exclusive Willowbrook Estates community that commanded such a price. Now, here's where things get interesting, and this is crucial to understanding how this entire conflict erupted. When Theodore Mitchell built his estate in 1952, Willowbrook Estates didn't exist. The surrounding area was largely undeveloped farmland and scattered residential properties. Theodore's estate was essentially a standalone manor in a rural setting. It wasn't until the 1980s that developers began purchasing the surrounding land, eventually creating the planned community of Willowbrook Estates. Here's the critical detail that would later become the center of a legal nightmare. When the developers created the HOA in 1987, they made a calculated decision to include Theodore's property within the community boundaries, despite the fact that the Mitchell family had never agreed to join the association, never signed any covenants, and had owned their property decades before the HOA even existed. The developer's reasoning was purely financial. Having a $20 million estate within their community boundaries would significantly boost property values for all the surrounding homes they were trying to sell. It was a brilliant marketing strategy. They could advertise that their community included one of the most prestigious properties in the entire county. But there was one problem with this strategy that wouldn't become apparent for decades. They never actually had the legal authority to include the Mitchell property in their HOA. For over 30 years, this detail went unnoticed. Theodore Mitchell was elderly and rarely left his property. When he passed away in 2005, Colonel Mitchell's father inherited the estate but was living overseas for his own military career. The property was maintained by a caretaking service, and there was minimal interaction with the surrounding community. The HOA collected dues from every other property owner, enforced their rules on every other resident, and generally operated as if the Mitchell estate was simply another property under their jurisdiction. Colonel Mitchell first learned about the HOA's claim over his property when he received a letter 3 weeks after moving in permanently following his retirement. The letter was formal, typed on official Willowbrook Estates letterhead, and signed by the HOA president, Margaret Whitfield. Are you starting to see how this powder keg was building? Because what happened next would set the stage for one of the most epic property disputes you've ever heard. The letter informed Colonel Mitchell that his property was subject to a $15,000 annual HOA fee, plus an additional $8,000 in special assessments for community improvements that had been voted on during his absence. But that wasn't all. The letter also included a list of 17 violations that the HOA claimed his property was currently committing. These violations ranged from the absurd to the insulting. According to the HOA, his grandfather's Italian marble fountains were non-compliant water features that created excessive noise during their operation. The hand-carved limestone walls that had been featured in architectural magazines were deemed inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. Even the mature oak trees that had been growing on the property for over a century were cited as landscaping violations because they exceeded the HOA's height restrictions for vegetation. But the violation that truly revealed the HOA's intentions was the most shocking of all. They claimed that the estate's main house exceeded the community's square footage restrictions and that Colonel Mitchell would need to either demolish portions of the structure or pay an additional $50,000 in oversized structure penalties annually. Remember, this is a house that was built in 1952, decades before their community even existed, by Colonel Mitchell's grandfather, on land that the Mitchell family had owned outright for over 70 years. Mitchell's initial response was measured and diplomatic, exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd spent 3 decades navigating complex military negotiations. He scheduled a meeting with the HOA board, preparing a comprehensive presentation that included the original property deeds, historical documentation of the estate's construction, and legal records proving his family's ownership predated the HOA by 35 years. But if you think the HOA was going to back down when presented with facts, you clearly haven't dealt with the type of people who volunteer for HOA board positions just to exercise power over their neighbors. The meeting took place on a Tuesday evening in the community center's main conference room. Colonel Mitchell arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and carrying a leather portfolio containing decades of documentation. He expected a reasonable discussion between adults who could review the evidence and reach a logical conclusion. What he got instead was a kangaroo court. Margaret Whitfield, the HOA president, was a retired real estate agent who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates specifically because she enjoyed the authority that came with HOA leadership. She'd been president for 8 consecutive years, running unopposed in every election because most residents were too intimidated to challenge her. Margaret had a reputation for being thorough, which was a polite way of saying she was obsessively controlling about every detail of community life. Joining her were board members David Chen, a middle manager at a local insurance company who compensated for his lack of authority at work by wielding excessive power in the HOA, and Patricia Williams, a retired teacher who treated HOA violations like classroom discipline problems that required swift and severe punishment. The meeting began with Margaret informing Colonel Mitchell that his property was currently accruing daily fines of $200 for each unresolved violation. Since he'd received the initial notice 3 weeks prior, his account already showed over $71,000 in penalties. When Colonel Mitchell calmly presented his documentation proving that his property predated the HOA, Margaret's response was stunning in its arrogance. She stated that regardless of when his property was built, it was currently within the community boundaries and therefore subject to all HOA rules and regulations. When he pointed out that his family had never signed any agreements or covenants, David Chen interrupted to explain that property ownership within the community boundaries constituted automatic membership. But here's where things get truly absurd, and this is where you can see the HOA's real motivation becoming crystal clear. Patricia Williams then presented what she called the Community Improvement Plan. According to this plan, the HOA had identified Colonel Mitchell's estate as the primary obstacle to a major development project that would significantly increase property values for all other residents. The plan involved selling the estate to a developer who would demolish the existing structures and build 12 luxury townhomes on the 15-acre lot. The HOA's position was simple. Either Colonel Mitchell could voluntarily sell his property to their preferred developer for $12 million, $8 million less than its actual value, or they would continue escalating fines and legal pressure until he was forced to sell anyway. When Colonel Mitchell asked about the legal basis for their authority over his property, Margaret Whitfield made a statement that would later become crucial evidence in the legal battle that followed. She told him that legal technicalities were irrelevant because the HOA had been operating under the assumption of authority for over 30 years, and that this constituted a legal precedent. Are you seeing the incredible arrogance here? This HOA was essentially telling a decorated military veteran that they intended to steal his family's property based on their own assumptions about their authority. Colonel Mitchell left that meeting with a clear understanding that he was not dealing with reasonable people who could be swayed by facts or logic. These were individuals who had convinced themselves that their desire for control superseded legal property rights, and they were prepared to use every tool at their disposal to get what they wanted. Over the following months, the HOA's campaign against Colonel Mitchell escalated in ways that would have been comical if they weren't so malicious. They hired a private investigator to monitor his property for additional violations. They filed complaints with the city about suspicious activities at his estate. They even contacted his former military colleagues, trying to gather information that might be used against him in their legal proceedings. The fines continued accumulating daily. By month 6, the HOA claimed that Colonel Mitchell owed over $340,000 in penalties. They filed liens against his property and began legal proceedings to force a sale to recover their claimed damages. But the HOA made one critical miscalculation in their strategy. They assumed that Colonel Mitchell, like most homeowners facing legal pressure from an established HOA, would eventually capitulate to avoid the stress and expense of a prolonged legal battle. They expected him to either pay the fines or sell the property and move somewhere else. What they failed to consider was that Colonel Mitchell wasn't just any homeowner. This was a man who'd spent 30 years in situations where backing down meant putting lives at risk. He'd negotiated with foreign governments, managed complex military operations, and earned respect through decisive action under pressure. And they had just declared war on the wrong person. Stay with me, because what Colonel Mitchell discovered during his own investigation into the HOA's claims would completely flip this entire situation on its head. While the HOA was busy accumulating fines and filing liens, Colonel Mitchell was conducting his own research into the legal foundation of their authority. What he discovered was more than just a lack of proper documentation. It was evidence of a systematic fraud that had been perpetrated for decades. Remember how the HOA claimed they had authority over his property because it fell within their community boundaries? Colonel Mitchell's investigation revealed that those boundaries had been illegally expanded in 1987 without proper legal procedures. The original HOA charter included only the properties that were part of the initial development. The Mitchell estate was added to the boundary maps later, without any legal authorization or documentation. But the fraud went even deeper. Colonel Mitchell discovered that the HOA had been collecting special assessments from all residents for the community improvements that specifically benefited his property. Things like road maintenance for the private drive leading to his estate and landscaping for the common areas that bordered his land. They had been essentially charging other residents to maintain his property while simultaneously claiming he owed them money. The most damaging discovery was a series of internal HOA emails from 2018 that Colonel Mitchell obtained through legal discovery. These emails revealed that the board had been discussing the Mitchell problem for years, specifically planning to use accumulated violations and fines to force a sale that would benefit the entire community through the planned development project. One email from Margaret Whitfield to the other board members was particularly incriminating. "The Mitchell property is our golden ticket. If we can force a sale and get that development approved, every property value in Willowbrook will increase by at least 15%. We just need to make life difficult enough that he gives up and sells." Now, you're probably thinking this sounds like a clear case of harassment and fraud, and you'd be absolutely right. But remember, this is an HOA we're talking about, and they were just getting started with their escalation tactics. The moment that would define this entire conflict came on a crisp October morning, when Colonel Mitchell returned from his daily run to find 3 HOA board members standing on his front steps, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy and someone who appeared to be a locksmith. Margaret Whitfield stepped forward with a folder of legal documents and announced that the HOA was exercising their right to secure the property due to unpaid fines that now totaled over $650,000. According to their interpretation of community covenants, accumulated fines of this magnitude gave them the authority to take possession of the property to protect the community's financial interests. This is the moment where most homeowners would panic. Faced with what appeared to be official legal action, accompanied by law enforcement, most people would assume they had no choice but to comply while sorting out the legal details later. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't most people. His first move was to calmly ask the sheriff's deputy to review the legal documents being presented by the HOA. The deputy, who had initially assumed this was a routine civil enforcement action, began reading through the paperwork. After several minutes, he looked up with a confused expression and asked Margaret Whitfield to explain the legal basis for the HOA's claimed authority over this property. Margaret's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. She explained that the property was within the community boundaries, subject to all HOA covenants, and that the accumulated fines gave them legal standing to secure the asset. She presented this information with the confident authority of someone who had been using similar tactics to intimidate residents for years. The sheriff's deputy then asked to see the original covenant documents that established the HOA's authority over Colonel Mitchell's property. This is where Margaret made her first critical mistake. Instead of producing the documents, she insisted that such paperwork wasn't necessary because the HOA's authority was established through decades of precedent. Colonel Mitchell seized this moment to present his own documentation. From his leather portfolio, he produced the original property deeds, showing his family's ownership dating back to 1952. He showed the deputy the original HOA charter from 1987. Which clearly defined the community boundaries and did not include his property. Most importantly, he presented a recent legal opinion from a property law specialist that definitively stated the HOA had no legal authority over his estate. But here's where Colonel Mitchell demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him successful in military command. He didn't just defend his position, he went on the offensive. Colonel Mitchell informed the sheriff, his deputy, that the HOA's attempt to take possession of his property constituted criminal trespassing and attempted theft. He explained that their claims of authority were fraudulent, their liens were illegally filed, and their attempts to force him off his property met the legal definition of extortion. The deputy found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. What had seemed like a routine civil matter was rapidly becoming a potential criminal investigation. He asked all parties to step back while he contacted his supervisor for guidance. During this pause, Margaret Whitfield made her second critical mistake. Apparently frustrated by the delay and convinced that her authority was being questioned inappropriately, she decided to escalate the situation. She instructed the locksmith to begin changing the locks on Colonel Mitchell's front door, stating that the HOA would secure the property regardless of the deputy's concerns. This was the moment Colonel Mitchell had been waiting for. In a voice that carried 30 years of military authority, Colonel Mitchell ordered everyone to stop what they were doing. He then addressed Margaret Whitfield directly, and what he said next would be talked about in Willowbrook Estates for years to come. He informed Margaret that her actions constituted multiple felonies under state law. He explained that attempting to illegally seize private property was theft, filing false liens was fraud, and using threats of legal action to extort property sales was criminal conspiracy. He then told her that every conversation, every meeting, and every document in this dispute had been carefully recorded and documented, and that he was prepared to file criminal charges against every member of the HOA board. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't finished. He explained that during his investigation into the HOA's claims, he had discovered financial irregularities in their accounting that suggested the misappropriation of community funds. He had documentation showing that special assessments collected for community improvements had been diverted to legal fees for their campaign against his property. Most damaging of all, he had evidence that the HOA had been inflating their legal expenses and billing residents for services that were never actually provided. The sheriff's deputy, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, asked Colonel Mitchell if he was prepared to file formal complaints about these alleged crimes. Colonel Mitchell's response was immediate and definitive. He handed the deputy a folder containing formal criminal complaints against Margaret Whitfield, David Chen, and Patricia Williams for theft, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Margaret Whitfield's reaction to this development revealed everything you needed to know about her character. Instead of acknowledging the serious legal jeopardy she now faced, she became indignant about Colonel Mitchell's threats and intimidation tactics. She demanded that the deputy ignore his wild accusations and proceed with securing the property for the HOA. This response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation that was about to cost her dearly. Margaret had spent so many years wielding unchallenged authority over intimidated residents that she couldn't recognize when she was facing someone who not only wouldn't be intimidated, but who had the knowledge, resources, and determination to fight back effectively. The deputy made the decision that effectively ended the HOA's campaign against Colonel Mitchell. He informed Margaret that based on the documentation presented, there appeared to be serious questions about the HOA's legal authority, and that any attempt to take possession of the property would be considered criminal trespassing. He advised all HOA representatives to leave the property immediately and resolve their dispute through proper legal channels. But the real climax of this story wasn't the confrontation on Colonel Mitchell's front steps. It was what happened next, when he decided to take the offensive in a way that would expose the full extent of the HOA's corruption and ensure that no other resident would ever face similar treatment. Colonel Mitchell filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the Willowbrook Estates HOA that was devastating in its scope and precision. The lawsuit didn't just challenge their authority over his property, it demanded a complete forensic audit of the HOA's finances, operations, and decision-making processes over the previous 10 years. The legal discovery process revealed a pattern of corruption and abuse that extended far beyond Colonel Mitchell's case. The HOA had been systematically targeting properties for harassment based on their potential for development. They had been inflating legal expenses and billing residents for unnecessary services. Most shocking of all, they had been accepting payments from developers in exchange for creating problems that would force property sales. But here's the detail that transformed this from a property dispute into a criminal investigation. The forensic audit revealed that Margaret Whitfield had been embezzling HOA funds for personal use, including a $40,000 consulting fee that she had paid to herself for managing the campaign against Colonel Mitchell. Are you starting to see how completely this situation had flipped? The HOA members who thought they could intimidate a retired military officer into selling his family as estate were now facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and the complete destruction of their reputations in the community. The final resolution of Colonel Mitchell's battle with the Willowbrook Estates HOA, was more satisfying than any revenge story you've ever heard, because it was entirely based on justice, legal precedent, and the consequences of trying to defraud the wrong person. The criminal investigation triggered by Colonel Mitchell's complaint revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond his individual case. Margaret Whitfield was ultimately charged with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The forensic audit of HOA finances revealed that she had stolen over $180,000 in community funds over a 5-year period, using various schemes including inflated vendor contracts, fictional legal fees, and unauthorized consulting payments to herself. David Chen and Patricia Williams were charged with conspiracy and fraud for their roles in the systematic harassment of residents and the illegal filing of liens. The investigation revealed that they had been targeting specific properties based on their development potential, using HOA violations as a tool to pressure owners into selling to their preferred developers. But the criminal charges were just the beginning of the consequences these HOA board members would face. Colonel Mitchell's civil lawsuit resulted in a judgment that effectively bankrupted the entire HOA board. He was awarded $3.2 million in damages, including compensation for harassment, illegal liens, damage to his property's marketability, and punitive damages for the fraudulent claims against his estate. Since the HOA's insurance policy didn't cover criminal activities by board members, Margaret Whitfield, David Chen, and Patricia Williams were personally liable for the full amount. The impact on their personal lives was devastating. Margaret Whitfield was forced to sell her home in Willowbrook Estates to pay her portion of the judgment. Her reputation in the community was completely destroyed, and her attempts to find employment in real estate were hampered by news coverage of her criminal conviction. David Chen lost his job at the insurance company when his employer learned about his legal troubles, and Patricia Williams faced social ostracism in a community where she had previously been respected. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't satisfied with just individual accountability. He wanted systematic changes that would prevent future abuse of homeowner rights. Working with a team of property law specialists, Colonel Mitchell developed a comprehensive reform plan that was ultimately adopted by the state legislature. The Homeowner Protection Act established strict oversight requirements for HOA operations, mandatory auditing of finances, and severe penalties for board members who abuse their authority. The law also included provisions specifically addressing situations like Colonel Mitchell's, where properties are included in HOA boundaries without proper legal authority. Any HOA claiming authority over a property must now provide documented proof of that authority, and homeowners have the right to challenge such claims through an expedited legal process. Most importantly, the law established criminal penalties for HOA board members who use their positions to harass residents, file fraudulent liens, or engage in extortion schemes. These penalties include mandatory jail time for embezzlement and conspiracy charges, ensuring that future HOA corruption would have serious personal consequences for those involved. The impact of Colonel Mitchell's victory extended far beyond legal reforms. News coverage of the case sparked a nationwide conversation about HOA abuse and homeowner rights. Property law experts used the case as a teaching example in law schools, and homeowner advocacy groups cited it as proof that residents could successfully fight back against corrupt HOA leadership. Within Willowbrook Estates itself, the changes were immediate and dramatic. The entire HOA board was replaced in an emergency election, with new leadership committed to transparency and legitimate community service. The new board's first action was to conduct a comprehensive review of all outstanding violations and liens, resulting in the dismissal of dozens of frivolous cases that had been used to harass residents. Property values in Willowbrook Estates actually increased following Colonel Mitchell's victory, despite the HOA's claims that his estate was harming community values. Potential buyers were attracted to a community where homeowner rights were protected and where corrupt leadership had been held accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of this entire story was how it affected Colonel Mitchell personally. Instead of being driven from his family's estate by bureaucratic harassment, he became a respected leader in the community. Residents who had been afraid to speak out against the previous HOA board now sought his advice on protecting their own rights. Colonel Mitchell established a consulting service to help homeowners facing similar HOA abuse, using his legal victory as a template for fighting back against corrupt community leadership. He donated a significant portion of his legal settlement to organizations that provide legal assistance to homeowners who can't afford to fight HOA abuse on their own. The estate itself became a symbol of successful resistance to bureaucratic overreach. Colonel Mitchell opened the gardens for community events and used the ballroom to host educational seminars about homeowner rights. The property that the HOA had tried to force him to sell became the center of community life in a way that honored his grandfather's original vision. 5 years after his victory, Colonel Mitchell reflected on the experience during an interview with a legal journal. He stated that the most important lesson was that bullies in positions of authority only succeed when good people are afraid to fight back. He emphasized that homeowners have more legal protections than they realize, but those protections only work when people are willing to use them. Colonel Mitchell's advice to homeowners facing HOA abuse was characteristically direct. Document everything, know your legal rights, and never let anyone intimidate you into giving up property that legally belongs to you. He stressed that most HOA bullies back down quickly when faced with someone who understands the law and is prepared to use it. The story of Colonel Mitchell's battle with the Willowbrook Estates HOA became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the HOA industry. Board members nationwide began receiving legal training about the limits of their authority and the serious consequences of overstepping those boundaries. Insurance companies began requiring HOAs to implement oversight procedures to prevent the kind of corruption that had destroyed the Willowbrook board. Today, Colonel Mitchell continues to live peacefully in his grandfather's estate, which remains one of the most beautiful properties in the county. The Italian marble fountains still operate daily, the limestone walls still showcase architectural excellence, and the gardens still provide a sanctuary of beauty in an increasingly hectic world. But more importantly, the estate stands as a testament to the principle that in America, property rights are sacred, and no amount of bureaucratic authority can override the fundamental law that protects individual ownership. Colonel Mitchell's victory proved that even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated when someone with the right knowledge, resources, and determination decides to fight back. The question this story leaves us with is both simple and profound. How many other homeowners are currently facing similar abuse from corrupt HOA leadership, and what would happen if they knew they had the legal tools and precedents necessary to fight back successfully? Colonel Mitchell's battle wasn't just about protecting his family's estate, it was about establishing the principle that homeowner rights matter, that corruption has consequences, and that sometimes the best defense against institutional bullying is a well-planned offensive that exposes the truth and demands accountability. In the end, the HOA that tried to steal a $20 million palace discovered that they had picked a fight with someone who understood that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the cost. And in this case, the cost of fighting back was far less than the price of surrender would have been. What would you do if faced with similar circumstances? Would you have the courage to stand up to institutional authority when you knew you were right? Colonel Mitchell's story suggests that the answer to that question might determine not just the outcome of your individual case, but the future of property rights for everyone in your community.